Now, Nick Xenophon has been out of the spotlight for 4 years. He first entered politics in the late 90s on an anti-pokies platform. He became famous for his political stunts. He often held the balance of power in the Senate, which was a great frustration to the government of the day. But why do I care about his return on this show now? Well, because since he quit politics in 2017, Nick Xenophon has acted as a lawyer and advocate for the Chinese telecom giant Huawei. It was, of course, banned from Australia's 5G contract on national security grounds. And Nick Xenophon fought against this. His advocacy often went much further than the legal work that he claimed. And Rex Patrick, who worked for Xenophon in the past, had this to say about his former boss's political return.
He was entitled as a private individual to work for whoever he wished. But the choice he made was akin to someone choosing to do PR work for the German companies Krupp or Messerschmitt in 1938. Mr Xenophon now says that he has not worked for Huawei for some time, though we don't know when he ceased. He now claims to support the Australian government's 5G ban on Huawei. As a declared Senate candidate, he should now, in the interests of transparency and accountability, disclose the full details of his contractual relationship with Huawei.
I spoke to Nick Xenophon about all of this a little earlier. Nick Xenophon, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I want to start with why you are returning to politics. You quit in 2017. Why do you want to come back to Canberra now?
Well, I left federal politics in 2017 to contest the 2018 South Australian state election. That didn't turn out. Whilst we got 19% of the statewide vote, I couldn't win a seat in the lower house, neither could any of the candidates that ran with me, terrific candidates. So that was, unfortunately, we didn't get across the line, even though it was a strong showing of 19%. I think it's the sort of figure that Clive Palmer would kill for. So for a whole range of reasons, I want to come back. I want to make a difference. There's unfinished business, and I'll give it my best shot. It won't be easy. It's going to be a very tough battle, starting basically from scratch after being out of the public eye for 4 years, but I'll give it my best shot.
One of the policy issues that you've been heavily involved in the past is when it comes to the digital tech giants and the media companies. Since then, we've had a media bargaining code, a deal struck, of course, between the government, the digital platforms and the news media. There's now a review into the news media and digital platforms, this bargaining code legislation. What is your view about what needs to happen in this space, and is the $200 million enough?
Well, let's go by way of a recap. During the very contentious media ownership laws, I voted for those laws because I felt there was no choice, that legacy media wasn't going to survive if you kept the existing ownership restrictions in place. And there was a lot of animosity towards me for going ahead with that. But we secured a regional fund for smaller publications, which has made a difference. Country towns, regional communities deserve good coverage of the news. The big issue is that Google and Facebook have become too powerful. They have literally siphoned off billions of dollars of revenue from traditional media. Why? Because they get more and more clicks generated by the work of journalists in existing media organisations. That's why the Media Bargaining Code was established, something that I strongly supported. Rod Sims has done a great job implementing it, but there's a lot more to do. Now,
Nick Xenophon, not everyone has welcomed your return to the political arena. Your former colleague Rex Patrick has likened your work for the telco Huawei to working for German companies like Krupp in 1938. What's your response to this? Any allusion to the Nazis, and by extension to the Holocaust, one of the worst events in human history, in my view, is pretty terrible. I mean, I think it wasn't becoming of Rex to say that. It's unfair, it's untrue. And interestingly, just a few months ago, Rex was very happy to
been endorsed by me to work with me when he was considering a tilt to the lower house seat. So I was very happy to be, arm in arm with me then, but not now, because we're competitors. The fact is, I've seen opinion polls very recently at the beginning of March, which showed that Rex, his polling was very, very low and nowhere near a Senate quota or even half or even a third of a Senate quota. So I believe I'm the best chance to represent the political centre, to advocate for South Australians on the issues that matter. And in terms of doing work for Huawei Australia, the law firm Xenophon Davis last did work for Huawei Australia over a year ago. We were not lobbyists. We did not engage with Canberra at all. We no longer have any involvement with them, but we did give them advice on their legal options in relation to allegations against them. No involvement, and I think it's important to put that in context.
Well, Nick, putting Rex Patrick aside, because clearly he does have political motivations here, and looking at the actual claims of what he said, we did know as early as December 2020, while you were acting for Huawei, that the company was involved in the CCP's genocide of Uyghurs who are in concentration camps in Xinjiang. How could you represent the interests of a company involved in this type of persecution?
Well, can I just say firstly in relation to the Uyghurs, I'm aware of the reports of Human Rights Watch and an eminent, a very well-respected human rights organisation, and I agree with them about their very serious concerns that they've raised about the treatment of the Uyghurs. Huawei Australia is a separate business. It had a separate board. In fact, Alexander Downer and John Brumby, a former Labor Premier of Victoria, were key members of that board in years gone by. The business in Australia was confined to issues of 5G in relation to matters about their Australian operations. I didn't act for Huawei International. It was very much confined to Australian issues. But I also make
you can't separate Huawei Australia from Huawei International. It is the same company. And the Washington Post reported in December 2020 that Huawei did test facial recognition software that could send automated Uyghur alarms to Chinese government authorities.
Sure, and the general principle there is that if a technology company, and I think it was a Wall Street Journal article around the same time, pointed out that a number of major American companies were providing technology that was being used in that province. I think the issue is what ought to be concerning, what ought to be condemned, is the use of that technology, and that's the primary concern. Those that use it, facial recognition.
You didn't have a problem representing a company that was engaging in this sort of work?
The scope of my work with Huawei was limited to the work in Australia about issues to do with 5G, to give them advice about the allegations made against them. I have no issue with what Human Rights Watch said.
You said publicly that Huawei was unfairly maligned. Countries around the world have banned Huawei on national security advice, not just Australia, but the UK did that as well, and so did the US. Do you think they were wrong to ban Huawei?
Oh, I think that the decision has been made, and that decision is pretty much irrevocable. My job now is to focus on issues that concern South Australians.
Do you stand by that statement that you made, that they were unfairly maligned, that they shouldn't have faced this ban on national security advice?
I think the statement I made was in pretty broad terms, that they were unfairly maligned, accused of things that they didn't do. And interestingly, Malcolm Turnbull in his autobiography actually said they found that the company did nothing wrong in Australia from a national security perspective, but there was a concern about what could happen down the track because the company is headquartered in China. I respect that. I mean,
it was Malcolm Turnbull who blacklisted Huawei and ZTE from Australia's 5G network in August 2018 on national security grounds, and Malcolm Turnbull has even taken you on Twitter over this issue.
And Malcolm Turnbull's autobiography actually said that as a company, they didn't do anything wrong. It was the concern about what would happen down the track.
Sorry to interrupt,
Yes.
but it's not just an issue that's, that you're representing it as an issue that's going to be weaponised against you by your opponents during a campaign. But Nick Xenophon, your advocacy on behalf of Huawei went far beyond legal representation. There was prominent media commentary, even against its critics, and you need to accept that. This was, you were attacking people like Peter Jennings for raising concerns about this. Peter Jennings from ASPI.
I think I return like with Peter, but and I've actually spoken at ASPI events in years gone by, and ASPI does perform an important role in terms of public debate and public discourse. But my issue is always going to be about local issues. I actually support the bipartisan approach of Labor, of a coalition and Labor, when it comes to our national security issues and foreign policies.
Provided you win, you will have a prominent position in the Senate. In the past, you have had the balance of power on key pieces of legislation. You can't only confine your role in Canberra to domestic issues. China and foreign interference is a major issue in our region and globally at the moment. The national security advice was that Huawei was a state-owned company with clear links to the Chinese government and that it should be banned from operating in Australia, and you disagreed with this.
Well, in terms of being state-owned, I think that it's a private company. It is a private company owned effectively by its employees, but that's overseas. But Huawei Australia is a private company, maybe a subsidiary of the company in China. But the issue here
intelligence advice, the intelligence advice from the Australian Signals Directorate and from ASIO and the intelligence agencies globally is that this is a company that was controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So do you think you know better than the intelligence agencies?
No, I don't. But what I do know is that I support the bipartisan approach of the coalition, of the Labor Party on national security issues, where you'll be finding, if I manage to get across the line in the Senate, I'll be focused. Sorry, I just need to say,
yes,
I'll be focused on domestic issues. That's where I think I can make a difference. You're not going to get me jumping up and down about national security issues where I think there ought to be a bipartisan approach in Australia's national interest.
There was a bipartisan agreement from both Labor's Senator Penny Wong and James Paterson, Andrew Hastie and the government that you should have registered yourself on the foreign interest registry, the foreign interest registry over your representation of Huawei. You didn't do this. Why?
Well, because the registry does not apply. Did not apply. It was just not appropriate to be a part of that registry. And one of the reasons why we have that registry is that so that people don't do things in secret, so that people aren't doing something on behalf of an organisation with foreign links in secret, so that it's not clear why people are doing that. I was pretty open about.
But you were representing a foreign company, and the reason the register was set up was to show the public people who are representing foreign entities. So shouldn't you have just disclosed your relationship on that registry?
Doing legal work for Huawei does not need to be on the foreign registry. It's as simple as that. And also, the foreign registry is all about making sure people don't do things covertly, where people don't know who they're actually representing. It was pretty obvious, as we know from this interview, that I was at all times open and upfront about representing, being the lawyers for Huawei.
Well, if it was legal work,
as a matter of law.
If it was legal work and not advocacy that you were engaged in, what litigation did you actually pursue in Australia on behalf of Huawei?
I've been a lawyer for quite a few years, and not all legal work leads to litigation. It's
so advice. There was none. There was none. There was no litigation.
I can't talk. I can't talk about the advice that I give, because that's legal professional client privilege. I mean, that's every lawyer in the country will tell you that. That's a very important tenet in our democracy, in a Western democracy, where that privilege is important. But I never had to be part of that registry. And if people want to define me by that, then they can. But I know what I'm interested in is talking about the issues that Australians, South Australians in particular, are concerned about. And when it comes to national security, when it comes to foreign policy...
Just before we move off the point about the legal work,
okay.
You know, you've repeatedly said that you were doing legal work, and you've repeatedly said publicly that you weren't doing any lobbying. But you did make a submission to the Intelligence and Security Committee on Huawei's behalf in November 2020. So that does count as government advocacy, requiring you to make a disclosure on the register.
Not as lawyers. It doesn't. I mean, we can go around in circles on this, and respectfully, it doesn't. It is simply not part of a requirement of the register. We were open about it. As lawyers, we do not have to be part of that register.
When you were advocating for Huawei, which included attacking its critics like Peter Jennings of ASPI, calling him a mouthpiece for a foreign weapons manufacturer, that wasn't legal work, that was public advocacy.
I think I was defending myself with some comments that Peter was making. But again, you know, if I had my time over again, should I have just zipped my lips when Peter was having a go? Maybe I should have, but it was pretty relentless from Peter. And, you know, I think Peter's a good bloke, does very important work. But again, to me, it's about domestic issues. It's about the cost of living. It's about people doing it really tough. It's about those community post offices that I spoke to today, who are mum and dad businesses, who are doing it very tough, and they provide a very valuable community service. And if we lose those, you rip the heart out of local communities in my state. I don't want that to happen.
China is a big issue domestically and internationally, Nick Xenophon, and I think it is important to understand what your position will be. Do you think that there should be a reset in the relationship between Australia and China?
My position is very clear. I actually support the position of the Australian government and the opposition, which is essentially bipartisan when it comes to dealing in our foreign policy, including our dealings with China. I think you'll find that if I get across the line and get into the Senate, I will be focused relentlessly on domestic issues, and you'll find me nodding in agreement with the government of the day in terms of what is essentially a bipartisan approach. But
what is your view? What is Nick Xenophon's, given you have represented Huawei, a company that's been blacklisted, yes, what is your view? What is your reaction to how China has been helping Putin out while the rest of the world is imposing sanctions on Russia?
I think in terms of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it is completely despicable. I think the West should do more. And I think that if China actively aids the Putin regime, that will have consequences given what governments around the world, Western governments, Western democracies have said. And can I just say one thing? There's been a debate about what's happening in the Solomon Islands, which is important. Years ago, when I was in the Senate, I campaigned relentlessly to ensure that we had more of a presence in the Pacific. Radio Australia, the shortwave services where the people of the Pacific Islands could hear Australia's perspective in terms of a liberal democracy on their doorstep, a country that was welcoming, that had democratic values, a free press, and open elections, and free and open elections. I think we need to re-engage more in the Pacific.
And will you be speaking out about China's growing reach, its foreign interference, its influence operations? Is that something you will be outspoken about? Do you think China has gone too far?
I will be I think the measured language of Foreign Minister Payne and the Shadow Foreign Minister Wong have served Australia well, that we speak out for our interests, that we ensure that Australia's interests are served, that we promote liberal democratic values, and I think that also means engaging more, spending more on our diplomatic budget in the Pacific, where particularly for countries like the Solomon Islands, in Vanuatu, in other countries, we need to step up and show that we are a real presence there, a presence that the Pacific region
But just on that question of foreign interference and foreign influence operations, do you object to how China has been interfering in Australian democracy?
you're going to get me. I'm going to simply say what I've said before. I agree with what the opposition, what the government has said on this issue, and the legislation that's been passed. I think the legislation is essential. Not just China, but any other country that wants to interfere with Australia's domestic policies. We've got to do what's in Australia's national interest first and foremost.